All right, see you all soon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Come on in. We're going to get started in just a minute here. I see that the participant list is popping up. People are coming in and joining, so bear with us just a second. If you're just coming in, thanks for joining. We're going to get started in just a minute here. We're going to leave about 2 more minutes for everyone to come in. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and say hello. I see everybody popping in and saying hi in the chat. I love it. The participant list is growing. I'm so excited you guys all decided to join us today. I see Florida, DC, New York, Palm Springs, North Carolina. This is amazing. Right, so I think that we will go ahead and get started. So once again, welcome to the Reunion Project. We are going to have a absolute great webinar today. So for those of you who may be joining us for the first time, the Reunion Project was founded in 2015 by activists living with HIV. The Reunion Project, also known as TRP, is the National Alliance of Long-Term Survivors of HIV, collaborating with local and national HIV advocates, providers, and researchers. Together, we convene and connect individuals and communities, sharing our experiences of survival and loss while honoring our past, and developing successful strategies for living and supporting one another today and into the future. Before we get too far into this, the Reunion Project would like to thank our funders. Absolutely. So thank you to Gilead, Vive, Avita, and Broadway Cares. Couldn't do it without you, so we appreciate the support. Few housekeeping things, okay? So we are on Zoom, as we have been for the last few years now. So keep in mind, this event will be recorded. Closed captioning is available, and you can find that in your little individual Zoom box. You push on the 3 dots and it'll give you the option to enable that. You can use the chat feature to ask questions. Feel free to ask as many questions as you like. We will try to get to as many of them as we can towards the end of the program, okay? If you wish to remain anonymous, you can either keep your camera off, keep the video turned off, and then you can also rename yourself again using those 3 dots in your box if you'd like to do that. And then at the end, please take a moment to fill out our evaluation that's going to be administered at the end of the webinar. It helps us stay on track and know how we're doing, okay? So today's program is participation in clinical research for long-term survivors of HIV. I know that there are a lot of issues affecting us as we age with HIV, so please follow along with the toolkit series and keep in mind that we want to stay focused on aging as it relates to research for this particular webinar. So try to limit your questions to that. For those of you who do not know me, I am Bridget Piku. I'm going to be your moderator for the day. I am a nurse and I hold a specialty in HIV and AIDS care. I've been a nurse in HIV and AIDS work for my entire nursing career. I've also been living with HIV for 10 years. I work at the Well Project and I am their stakeholder liaison. So part of my job is to bridge the gap between clinicians and those of us that are living with HIV. I also work for a research institute here in Palm Springs where I live called BIOS. So doing a little bit of research nursing as well. I was diagnosed at 40, which put me right on the cusp of starting to age with HIV. I am now 50, definitely aging and definitely feeling it, but I'm excited to be here with all of you today to get us started. I'm going to introduce our panelists. So our presenters today are going to be the wonderful Dawn Averett. She's going to be our keynote. We'll have a little conversation and some questions. We have the fabulous Matt Sharp, and then the always amazing Jeff Taylor. So Dawn and I will get started, and then I will bring in Matt and Jeff so they can have a conversation, and then the four of us will get together and also kind of go through some questions and then take your questions at the end. So a little bit about our keynote speaker, about Dawn. Dawn began working in HIV/AIDS arena in 1993 after being diagnosed with HIV in 1988. In addition to being the mother of 3 daughters, she has founded 2 nonprofit organizations, WISE, the Women's Information Service and Exchange, and in 1995, the Well Project. In 2002, to improve the lives of women living with HIV and AIDS. As a social justice advocate for people living with HIV and AIDS, Dawn also launched a think tank in 2003, now called the Women's Research Initiative on HIV/AIDS, or the WRI, which drives more, better, faster research in women and has been responsible for many notable achievements, such as facilitating the GRACE study, and building network collaborations, guiding FDA labeling decisions, and shaping research and policy priorities at the NIH. In the past 25 plus years, she's developed programs to increase awareness, accelerate testing, provide access to treatment, disseminate information, and expand clinical trials. Dawn has also served as a member of the Perinatal HIV Guidelines Committee from 2007 to 2012, the Office of AIDS Research Advisory Council from 2008 to 2012, and 2 terms on the Scientific Program Committee for CROI, as well as served two terms on the President's Advisory Council on HIV/AIDS, PACHA, from 2010 to 2015 during the Obama administration. So everyone give a virtual welcome and a hand clap for Ms. Dawn Averett. Hi, Dawn.
Hello. Hey there. Oh,
How are
now that
you?
we've all enjoyed the bio, I'm great. Thank you.
It's so good to see you.
Good to see you too. It's good to see all these tiny little boxes.
I know, right? I was excited to see how many people are and from how far away some of them are. So that's amazing.
It is amazing. It is amazing. And it is so radically different than the early days. And I recognize so many faces and names out there. So if our paths have crossed, my warm greetings to you once again. I was looking at my picture and Matt's picture and Jeff's picture, and I thought, well, right there's 100 years of living with HIV. That was a perfect. So anyhow,
how about it?
It's good to be here.
Excellent, excellent. So why don't we jump right in? There's a couple questions that I would love to ask and get your take on. Starting with, Why do you think it's so important to ensure that older persons living with HIV and AIDS and long-term survivors are included in clinical research?
Well, we could talk for the entire hour on that, but I appreciate the question. I think the first part of that question is part of our challenge, which is this whole idea of how we define aging and who's older and who's oldest. And this is a tough and I think evolving area for us to think about. So that's from the get-go, that's part of the reason we need to be doing research that is really looking at those of us who've been living with HIV for a long time and those of us who are newly diagnosed with HIV but over 50, grown-ups, and have a lot of really important questions. I also think that this dichotomy we have between actual chronological age and time lived with HIV disease is actually a really important place for us to really spend some time and do some really good, thorough research. I think we will see over time that there are ways in which those who are perinatally infected or infected at an extremely young age with HIV now have similarities to some of us who've been living with HIV for 35 years, but are now, AARP card members. So I think that there's so much nuance to this conversation around both being long-term survivors and also aging. Although there's crossover, it is not the same thing necessarily. And I think both the places where those things intersect, as well as the edges where they don't intersect, are equally important for us to understand.
Yeah, definitely. And you make a good point that there are intersections and there are places that they don't meet. But I think one of the things that I'm most proud of is that there's always space for all of us in the work, right? Yeah.
Right.
What do you think are some of the past challenges about getting women and people of color into trials, and has that changed?
Well, I think the past challenges are probably well known by most everybody in this virtual room. So I won't belabor the conversations many of us have had over and over and over and over again about just systemic and socioeconomic challenges. But I think that there has been some progress. I think the more we insist that it's not acceptable for research to be done without being inclusive and answering questions for all people living with HIV, the more we kind of make it so. And the more uncomfortable we make the FDA and the NIH and industry sponsors and others who have, historically, I'm not saying that they don't care, but what they have historically said is, it will take longer, cost more, maybe prohibit actually getting a result in these studies if we take the time to enroll hard to reach populations, which basically by definition was women and people of color. And I think now we've had a number of experiences where we've shown that that's not true. If we think about who we partner with to do the research, where we place the sites, how we support the sites, how we communicate about what the goals of the research and the protocols are. I mean, all of those things, I often say there's no kind of rocket science here. There's basically a small tweak at every single step, from what are the research questions that need to be asked to where do we do the research and how is it implemented. And if we start from the get-go with a commitment to enroll diverse populations, that's where we see the whole thing change. It's the 11th hour. Oh my gosh, we don't have any women on this study, and we wanted to close next month. Can you find some? It doesn't work. And I think we've seen that time and again. That does mean, as an activist and an advocate, I have to be really mindful about the kind of guidance and the advocacy I do with anybody who wants to do research, and kind of making sure that they understand how critically important this is. That partnership with the community is essential, and without kind of being clear from the outset. I mean, honestly, all you have to do is look at the Descovy PrEP debacle from my perspective. And let me be the first to say there's culpability across the board. I mean, we as activists have responsibility. Clearly the sponsor does, the FDA does. Lots of people saw that train rushing off the cliff. And so I think that that's an important opportunity for us to remind or to remember that getting involved early on makes all of the difference. And I think that that's why we've seen some success and some real movement in more effective recruitment and hopefully retention in clinical studies anyway. Still a lot more to be done, for sure.
And that's the parallel between people aging with HIV and getting into trials, right? The same challenges that were faced then are what we're facing now.
Yeah, I think I find the kind of arguments around whether or not we should allow people over 65 in studies and things like that to be very, very much like the early arguments about whether or not women could participate. Obviously, it's not about pregnancy and teratogenicity, but it is about like, this is uncharted territory. And, in women, it was always, well, we don't know what, the impact of hormones over the life cycle is, and that's just a big black box we can't get into. That's going to confound the research that we're doing. And I think that I hear a lot of that same kind of reticence about allowing people who are older, to participate in studies like, comorbidities, there's polypharmacy, there's all these things going on, and how will we tease all of that out? And it is more complicated. That's a legitimate concern. It is more complicated. It is not acceptable for us not to figure out how to address it, to stratify, to do things that help us to get the answers. We know that, what is it? I think, I can't remember what year. It's in the next couple of years. I mean, the number of people living with HIV over 50 is, it's more than half now, isn't it? I think
It is.
in the next couple of years. So, it's unacceptable in this environment to kind of bow out, if you will, from answering those questions up front.
Yeah, I think part of that comes down to autonomy too, right? Like giving people the choice for what they want to do. Yeah. So what ideas do you have for ways that we can move the needle to make some of this stuff happen?
Well, our voices are really important. I mean, frankly, I'm so excited seeing how many people signed up just to have this conversation and to be on the webinar. I think there is an assumption that in the absence of us kind of making ourselves known and being present, that there's a lack of interest in participating in research. I also think that, frankly, there's a lot of education to be done on both sides about, what it means to participate in research. It isn't always going to be an intervention. It isn't always going to be a therapeutic research study. There are lots of ways to participate in research that are, range from collecting your feedback on a survey and your experiences as a way to kind of, put a big toe in the pool, so to speak, to very kind of complex and involved research studies. I know many of us have been involved in working on compensation around participation in clinical trials and really shifting the conversation from the kind of clinician researcher subject paradigm that we have been dealing with for so many years to really kind of partners and co-conveners in studies. And I think the more that we do that, the more that we show up on a level that says, I'm going to take this seriously, and I need to see the respect, coming back in both directions, that we are we're collaborating on this research. You can't get the answers to it if nobody participates in your study, and I can't get the answers I need if I'm not willing to kind of engage. So I really do think that there's a lot of opportunity right now to help people understand how they can engage and who they can call and what small steps, and also what your questions are. I mean, I get asked all the time by researchers, like, what are the questions? And, I was diagnosed almost 35 years ago, and I still have a lot of questions. Increasingly, there are things changing in my life. I'm trying to embrace some of those changes. I love them all, but nonetheless, I have a lot of questions. What happens when somebody's been maximally suppressed for 20 years? And at what point do we see degradation in viral reservoirs? And, is this really going to be the thing we have to take? Are we going to have to take antiretroviral therapy for the next 60 years? Or in fact, are things really going to change? And that kind of research has to happen with those of us who've been living with this disease for a very long time. So I think that there are real opportunities that are not just, oh yeah, let's throw a token gesture and have a few 65-year-olds in this study. There are real questions to be answered.
Absolutely. I saw someone in the chat say something very similar to that these are the questions that those of us that are aging need to know. We need to know how it's going to affect us biologically. Not just, I think people think of the long term as, the period of time that you're on your antiretroviral therapy. But what happens if I stop after a certain time, or after I've been maximally suppressed, like you said? So there are definitely some opportunities there. And I think one thing that I think about, and I want to know what you think about it too, is that I think that researchers in science need to learn how to humanize kind of the way that that they approach the science. And we, as persons living with HIV, need to recognize that they are humans that are doing this science, right? And so that reaching across the aisle.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And I think sometimes distilling this down into people talking to people, they're actually getting out of the stats, getting out of the numbers, getting out of the case studies, and really sharing it on a really very human level. And, it seems like in the early days, I don't remember nearly as many researchers who were also people living with HIV in the field. And also the field wasn't open. There was a lot of stigma even for them. And increasingly, we have really some extraordinary voices, both as researchers who are also living with HIV and also allies. I think that anytime the conversation gets really technical, I'm naturally inclined to pull back and share something on a personal level, or talk about this as a person to a person. If I'm your sister or your mother or your best friend, what the heck would you do in this situation? And that makes people use a different part of their brain, I think. And it causes us all to kind of take a step back and think about things in a much more humanistic, human-centered way.
Yeah. And there's also the element of experience that comes into it when you're talking about long-term survivors, right? So there's practical knowledge and things that we have to offer, and we never stop growing and never stop learning. And so that has to be an element in who you choose for the research too, right?
Yeah. There's a lot of training. And I know I can see from the faces on these screens, people who have also been doing this training for a very long time. But, the shift in how we are viewed in research as both community-based researchers, as advocates and educators, as enablers and facilitators, as well as participants, is really important. That kind of very multidimensional relationship we have with research. I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, this matters to me. And this matters to me on a whole number of levels. So I think that remembering to, it's easy because we were so trained, the doctor knows best, and, to kind of defer. And I think remembering just how much power we actually have is a critical part of our success in getting the research done that we want, and also our survival and our well-being.
Absolutely. Our voices are very, very powerful. And I think you're right. We do sometimes forget the power that our voices have. And so with that, I'm going to pass a little bit of the baton over to the guys. I'll introduce the guys and let them get in here and start talking about some of their experiences and what they've gone through. So I'm going to introduce Jeff and Matt to you all. So Jeff Taylor is a long-term survivor who's been living with HIV for more than 40 years. He's been a participant in HIV research trials, starting with the early AZT trials in the 1980s. He's been an active HIV advocate for over 30 years, including 3 different Martin Delaney Cure Research collaborations, is the co-chair of the Community Advisory Board of the AMFAR Institute for HIV Cure Research. And currently, he is the Community Engagement Coordinator for the RID HIV CAB, as well as the Executive Director of HARP, of the HIV and Aging Research Project, Palm Springs, which is also known as HARP. And Jeff has served as a community advisor to many research groups, including the AIDS Clinical Trial Group, ACSD, Antiviral Research Center, CAB, and the NCI's AIDS Malignancy Consortium, and their anchor and anal cancer prevention study. And then Matt, let's bring Matt on. Matt Sharp is a long-term AIDS survivor, AIDS activist, writer, and educator. Matt was raised in Texas, and after graduating high school, he traveled to New York, where he received a Ford Foundation scholarship to study ballet. In 1988, he was diagnosed with HIV and settled in San Francisco to try to get the latest and best possible treatment, care, and support. He joined the ACT UP Golden Gate, working to mobilize and educate the HIV community for direct action in the fight against AIDS, eventually joining thousands of other activists in their civil disobedience demonstrations. He became the director of the Healing Alternatives Foundation in San Francisco, AIDS Buyers Club, which was a nonprofit cooperative offering complementary therapies before the drugs were available. Kudos on that. Later, he was hired as an outreach coordinator for the AIDS Clinical Trial Unit at San Francisco General. He taught HIV treatment certification trainings. Matt has done a lot here. I can't possibly get through all of this and still have time for you guys to have questions. I'm so impressed. He's served on several advisory committee boards, several AIDS drug and blood projects. He's just amazing. Let's bring him on so he and Jeff can have a little conversation about all of the things that they've done and their contributions and questions about HIV trials and older people with HIV.
Great. Thank you, Bridget. And
Absolutely.
Don, for your great conversation, and hopefully we can shed a little bit of light on kind of our personal experiences in being in HIV research trials. So Matt, you and I go way back, and it's great to see you. And you were involved in a really fascinating trial that's kind of come full circle, and now we're looking at that approach once again. So could you tell us a little bit about the early Sangamo trial you were in, and what that was like for you, and what it meant? Matt, are you unmuted?
Is he having some technical difficulties?
Yeah, maybe.
He's having some technical difficulties.
Okay. So Jeff, we can start with you while they get that worked out. Because it's Zoom and Zoom does what it does.
Yeah,
Sometimes it's out of our control.
right. Okay, so I'll launch into kind of my personal experience in being in a cure trial. I was involved in cure research from the minute I got diagnosed. I was formally diagnosed in 88. I know I got the virus in 81 or 82. So by the time I got tested, I already had 200 T cells. At the time, they weren't calling that, AIDS like they are now. It was not an AIDS diagnosis. So the first thing I did was sign up for trials because that was the only way to get access to meds then. ACT was not approved for people who didn't have PCP or KS. And fortunately, that was me. And I just kind of went down that research rabbit hole because we knew from the outset that we needed drugs. And that's what all the activism was about. And so I signed up in Chicago, where I was living at the time, for an early ACT trial. And fortunately got the placebo the first time around and learned a lot about trial design, because that may have saved my life, because as we know, the really early ACT trials were had really high toxic doses and hurt as many people as it helped. And as we all know, it didn't work by itself. But I became one of those people who just signed up for each and every trial and new drug as it came along. And I really credit that to keeping me alive until the cocktail came out in 1996. So I became a fully committed activist and research activist in particular, and moved to San Diego actually because they had such a strong research portfolio. Doug Richmond headed the AIDS clinical trials group there, and I realized in 1989 that one more Chicago winter was going to kill me, and I had to go someplace sunny and warm. And San Diego was my choice because of all the amazing research that was happening there, and was invited to start the first advisory board for the AIDS clinical trials group after activists kind of broke down the doors to say, we need to be at the table. As somebody said in the chat, nothing about us without us. And that's really been a mantra. And I think, you and Don were just talking about this. I mean, it needs to be all of us, right? Not just the ones who break down the door first, but everybody else. We break down that door for a reason, so everyone can go through. So go ahead.
I was just going to ask what it was like being on those early trial boards.
So, the first trial I was in was a placebo-controlled trial, and that's the gold standard for this. You have, you take the new drug, in this case it was ACT, or the standard of care, which was nothing. Of course, we knew that not doing anything would kill you. I was told when I got my diagnosis it was a death sentence, but nevertheless, that's what it was. And they had the clinical trial endpoints. What they're looking for at the end of the study is, for this one, was who lived and who died. Those are pretty stark endpoints. And we don't do that anymore. Now we realize we put everybody on. We know what's going to happen if you don't treat people. Let's try. But that was one of the barriers that we had to break down. So that was a really kind of stark lesson for me as to why we needed activism in trials. And I was really lucky I got out of that trial alive and got the placebo, and later did get access to treatment as they started reforming the trials and how they were designed.
Yeah.
So the cure trial that I signed up for was called the small company in Norway called VAC Bionor, and they had a product called VAC4X, which is designed, it's peptides, so part of the molecular structure of the antigens of the HIV virus. And so they combined 4 of these, hence the name VAC4X, and gave these to people as an intranasal spray. And that was the treatment. So this was probably 1996-ish that it was in the trial. It's been a long time, so I really had to kind of rack my brain as to what how this all worked. But I was living in San Diego and I drove to LA. Cedars-Sinai was one of the trial sites. David Hardy, who's been in HIV forever, many of you may know, a real advocate. He's one of those allies that you guys were talking about earlier. He's been amazing and jumped at the opportunity to do this. And so I signed up and did the trial. Unfortunately, the timing was that it started right at the beginning of flu season. So I found out later, of course, it was randomized and I'm blinded. I found out later I was on the real drug, got it. But then within a week after getting the treatment, I came down with the seasonal flu. So I was on the treatment interruption. They had to stop our drugs, and they immediately started me back on. My viral load went up. and I was
Yeah.
sick. And that was a lesson, I think, to everybody, is that you got to think about when you're doing your trials during the course of the year. The same thing happened with COVID, right? COVID started happening and screwed up all the trials. So, whatever, it's not just HIV in the world, right? There's lots of other
Right.
things. We're talking about
Absolutely.
getting older. We have lots of comorbidities, and there's lots of stuff out there that we have to deal with. So it was a real lesson, I think, for everybody, and how
Yeah.
to and I don't know if that effect, I think they were doing this over the course of time. So there are lots of other people who were able to complete the therapy, and that it wasn't promising, it didn't advance. And that's another lesson in research, right? Isn't that not everything works? And that's
Mhm.
why you do research, to find out what does work and what doesn't. And as a research volunteer, when you sign up, you've got to, know that that's the case. And especially in cure research, we have socio-behavioral researchers like Corinne Dubé, who I think is done a lot of really
Amazing.
amazing work in around cure research and what it means to people, is that people have this therapeutic misconception that it's this therapy that we're testing is going to help them. And
Right.
eventually it's going to be part of a piece towards a cure, but it's just that, it's a piece. It's like
Yeah.
a wheel on a car. A wheel by itself is not going to get you there. You need everything else. And so we're looking at the pieces one by one to see what looks like it'll work when you put it together with a bunch of other things. And so it's a really important part of, I think, what we're doing, and the education that we as activists have to do to our communities. I think a lot of us who were involved in the very early research trials, it was really obvious back then that you needed to do that. And now we have really successful treatments. We don't have to do this. We're going to be fine with what we've got. But there's so many unanswered questions and so much more we could do. And obviously, is a cure is something we really, really want. So
Yeah.
is Matt back on and able to?
I've been looking out for him. I don't see him yet.
I don't think that he's connected yet. I think he's having some issues connecting, unfortunately.
Okay.
So Bridget,
Well-
actually, sorry, this is Dawn. I just wanted to jump in really quickly because Jeff, it is so poignant to remember that when we started trials, I did my first clinical trial was a protease inhibitor study in 1994. And when we started them, we were doing them to stay alive. It was access. It was a very different time. And so I think as we talk about getting involved in research and thinking about participating in research, it does take on a different, there's a different relationship with it in some ways. And that certainly makes enrolling studies more difficult and everything else. It is much more, frankly, altruistic than it was even then. Because, it was kind of I remember when I actually got on the study, I lived in Georgia and I had to travel to Albany, New York to get one of the few spots. And it was like winning the lottery. And it was a game changer for me. But I have to keep in mind, like participating in some of the cure research that I'm participating in now is really, I'm learning interesting things because I'm a science geek, but it's not actually changing, my care or disease management right now. And it's really about kind of driving our understanding forward. And I find that very satisfying, but it's different.
I think that's a really important connection to raise, is that it's one of the things that I learned when I first started learning about HIV and learning about the different modalities and treatments and trials and things. It struck me that that's one thing that the HIV community will do, is step up and get involved in these types of things, because we know that it's going to help the next man, right? It may not help us in the immediacy of the moment, but it'll help someone eventually. And since Matt hasn't come on yet, there was a question that I actually would like one of you to tackle right now, which is, someone was asking if you could define cure research for those who are unfamiliar.
So that's a loaded question. Obviously, we all want a cure, but what does that look like? And there's lots of ways we can get there. The trial that I was in, I don't know, the terminology is changing, right? We're always changing how we talk about HIV, mostly to make it more human, right? We're no longer guinea pigs or test subjects we're not HIV infected individuals, we're people living with HIV, that sort of thing. But yeah, it can look a lot of different ways. There's some approaches. One of them is to just eliminate the virus altogether, right? This is what happened with the famous Berlin patient, Timothy Ray Brown. He had cancer, his cancer therapies weren't working, and he also had HIV. So they said, well, we need to do a bone marrow transplant. That was the treatment, salvage treatment for people with who were failing their, or whose chemotherapy and radiation were failing them, we should say. And so they gave him basically a brand new immune system transplanted for somebody who was immune to HIV. And that completely eradicated over time all traces of HIV in his body. And they looked, and for a while they kept finding little bits and pieces, viral particles, and after a while they could find nothing. So it really, worked in that respect. So that would be a home run, what we'd all like. But what he went through to get that, the bone marrow transplant, all that, you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy. And up to a third of the people who go through that die. So, and there's been lots, it took many years to replicate what he did. They knew exactly what happened, how to do it, but people were dying of the cancer before it worked, or the treatment itself did that. So kids don't try this at home, right? It's not something we want to look for. But there's lots of other ways. Can we just keep the virus asleep, what they call block and lock? We all know that the HIV virus can be dormant in the body, and can we just keep it that way? Right? We take the meds, everything's kind of sequestered away in the reservoir is asleep, and if you don't wake it up, it's not going to cause a problem. Can we find a way to make that happen and still stop the meds that we have to take every day? This is one way, and there's other approaches that they're looking at, but it's basically, do you kind of coexist with the virus and keep it in remission, which is a way we're starting to talk about it now, or do we to pull out all the guns and try to find a way to remove it from the body? And now they're looking at a lot of gene therapy approaches where you take your own cells out, modify them. And this is what hopefully Matt will get a chance to talk about in the trial that he was in. They took his cells out, made them immune to HIV through genetic manipulation, multiplied his cells that had been manipulated and put them back into his body. And it had an amazing, it didn't quite cure him, but it showed that that approach can work. And it also gave him a lot of clinical benefits. And I hope he gets a chance to talk about that, because that's the other exciting part is, along the way, there's things that we, especially as long-term survivors, some of us never got our T cells back. Can we find ways with these therapies to repair our immune system, not to get rid of the virus? Because, we've been through a lot, and we want to live full lives after we get rid of the virus as well, right?
Definitely. It's about thriving as opposed to just surviving. And that doesn't just mean emotionally, like we want to be there physically as well. So absolutely. So let's talk about some of the issues that come up, right? When we talk about long-term survivors being in clinical trials. So what are some of the ways that people of a certain age can get involved in clinical trials?
I think either of us could take that, but I think just signing up and being aware of what's out there. And Stephen Vargas put in the chat a lot of really great resources. There's this, a lot of major cities have centers for AIDS research, where these are federally funded research initiatives that bring together the universities and various institutions to work on AIDS research. And these days, a lot of it is focused on cure. And the AIDS clinical trials group that we talked about has been around for 30 some years now. They have sites in a lot of major cities across the country. Find out what they're doing. Sign up for an advisory board. Start Googling on the internet, but be careful, because not everything on the internet is true. There's a lot of stuff about their, so-called cure stuff. So, put on your filters and when you do that, but there's a lot of stuff happening right there. There's been a huge investment in HIV cure research. I think many of us remember when Obama earmarked $100 million for AIDS research, and that's only increased over time. And we're really fortunate that it's enjoyed bipartisan support for the NIH and for cure research in particular, that we have the luxury of doing this now. So I think there's a lot of people can do. And then, groups like this, TAG, Treatment Action Group in New York, has a great blog written by Richard Jeffries, and he follows everything. That man is an amazing community scientist who knows so much. And
Yeah.
So there's stuff out there, and just educate yourselves. Ask any of us, and we'll point you to what's in your neighborhood that you could, start following and maybe participate in.
Yeah, definitely. Dawn, are there particular tools in place? Just thinking about the way that clinical trials are structured in general, are there tools in place in the form of oversight boards? And how do those kind of work? And are they working?
As well as I had to unmute myself. Yeah, there definitely, there's data safety monitoring boards. There's also other boards, depending on who the sponsors are of the study. There are different types of systems for managing. But, I think in terms of finding out what's out there and accessing the research that's ongoing, is that really kind of what you were thinking? Or were you thinking, okay. I have forever, I feel like clinicaltrials.gov might be the death of me, but it's not the not not the most friendly resource out there, but there is information to be had, and at least it's a starting place. In addition, coming out of CROI, which is next week, there's going to be a lot of community report backs. There are these margarita breakfast clubs every morning during CROI where people, even if you're not registered for CROI, you can sign up and go to these sessions where community is sharing kind of what the most interesting findings and discussions were at the meeting, and having some of the presenters actually come on those calls and present. So there are mechanisms to engage, and probably Reunion Project can just send out a link, or maybe to everyone who signed up on this call or something like that, so that those who are interested in joining that. I think part of it is just the way it worked in the early days when we had organizations we were all spending a lot of time at in person, and lots of people were out on disability, and things were really different in terms of how information was shared. We were all going to town hall updates and reading newsletters and things like that. And it's really different now. So kind of tapping back into how community shares information through this organization, through other organizations, and various listservs. And there are a lot of ways in which the conversations happen, and the cure research space is big. And it's diverse, and there's a lot of different, if you're not ready to sacrifice lymph nodes, that's okay. There are lots of other ways to get involved in some of that, and even share your perspective on whether or not you'd be willing to participate. That information is extremely important. So, I encourage people to take even baby steps into this, but there are surprisingly more opportunities than you know. The challenge, and I can tell you this from personal experience, 2 years ago, I decided that I wanted to participate. I wanted somebody to tell me what's happening to all of these reservoirs I've got after all of these years. And I'm pretty well connected, and I know a lot of people, and it was not easy. It was not easy to find the right group and the right person to pay attention, to respond to my interest in them looking at my blood and seeing what they could find. So I'm not going to pretend that it doesn't take a kind of some commitment and interest to really track it down and find it. But reach out to one of us, look at who's presenting the papers, watch any of the post-CROI, cure symposia that come out. I mean, there are lots of different mechanisms, and it's not just cure research. There's a lot of really interesting research out there that benefits from our experience.
Absolutely.
I see Matt.
I see Matt. How about it? While we still have some time, we definitely want to give you a chance to talk about your clinical trial experience, Matt. Hi.
Apologies, it was a little bit of a nightmare this morning. I had to come into the city to do the webinar because I have little job to do here, so I had to be here. So, and then they were closing off traffic. San Francisco, it's a nightmare. So,
Yes.
yeah. So, you want to talk about my overall experience, or just
Well,
the
this,
things?
we were talking about the Sangamo trials. You know, we don't have a lot of time left, so if you could focus
Sure.
on that. I gave a little bit of background, but
Okay.
what happened to you? This is what we want.
Yeah, I was talking to my housemate this morning about that trial because he wasn't aware of it. And I said, I really don't want to talk much about that trial because I think everybody has heard about it, but they haven't. So what actually happened was I was approached by the head of the clinic that was doing the study, Dr. Jay Lalazari at Quest Research. And he knew that I was an advocate for peer research. So he sort of took me aside. We went to lunch and he said, hey, I have this great new trial coming up. There's a zinc finger protocol from Sangamo. And would you like to be in the trial? I said, well, maybe. I know, what does it involve? I mean, gene therapy? That sounds really scary. It's going to mess with my DNA. And he said, no, I think it's going to be pretty safe. But I said, well, let me look into it. I talked to Richard Jeffries. I talked to some other scientists. And then I got back to Jay and I said, okay, I'll do it. But I don't want to be the first participant. Sign me up as the second participant. So he did that. Jay's an old friend. I've been in many of his trials. Anyway, long story short, the trial was fairly simple. It was an infusion that I did. It was at first they did apheresis where they take out my blood out of my body, and then they separate the white from the red blood cells. And the white blood cells are shipped off to the company where they manipulate them to block the receptor for the co-receptor for HIV. And then they multiply them and they send them back to the laboratory, to the clinic, and they infuse it in. It's about like a month, 2 months later or something like that. And the infusion only took about 15 minutes. And that was it. I was done. I was done with that part of my part of the trial. Of course, they come in and give blood every few weeks. So long story short is this trial was one of the first trials in cure research to try to look for a cure, or at least for a functional cure. And it did not reach that goal. The people that were in the first trial, there was, I believe, six people, maybe more, in San Francisco, and there was another site in Philadelphia. And what happened was they combined the data for those two trials. And what happened was kind of interesting. It didn't reach the functional cure. Obviously, I'm not sure, nobody was. But what was very interesting, and they didn't really go into this with us, nobody did at the site or the Sangamo people. We went to Croy that year, the conference, the retrovirus conference, and I was sitting in the audience with some of the researchers, and they were presenting the data for this trial. Well, suddenly they get to my number and they start showing the numbers of the clinical trial participants on the graph. And the graph was showing T cell responses. Well, guess what? Everyone in the trial, almost everyone in the trial, their T cells doubled. That was a side effect of the trial. Remember, most of us were multi-drug resistant. We were still taking antiretrovirals, but they were somewhat effective, keeping us undetectable. However, we really needed something to push us over the undetectable line. So that when that slide was presented, I'll never, ever forget it, because I knew my number. I was 302, I think, or something like that. That was my participant. And I saw my graph, my T cell line went up. It was like crazy. I've been trying to get my T cells up for forever since I was infected. And never I'd been undetectable maybe once. So long story short, that was the result of this trial. The company refused to take it any further because their indication was to really look to see if they could find a functional cure using this gene therapy approach. And so they didn't want to spend the money to help patients like me double their T cells. So that was the sort of unexpected result from the trial. It was fantastic, but man, it was disappointing that they didn't do a confirmational trial. So hopefully we'll be moving forward with that soon, though. I hope.
Well, just quickly to piggyback on that, those results did not go unnoticed. And just recently, another researcher has picked that up and they're going to revisit that. And we've been meeting with them and talking with them about doing that. So, this goes to show that, research can lie dormant for, a decade or more like this did. And we've been beating the drum ever since saying, hey, this happened. Why isn't anybody doing anything? And finally somebody did. So
it was a long fight. It was a long fight with the regulators, with the company. And I will tell you one more interesting thing about this. There was another study that they did that was not in the same population of people. So this was a little healthier people. And what they found out is I know a couple of people in that trial that stopped their antiretrovirals. They did the gene therapy just like I did. And they were not, after like 7 years now, I think, they had not gone back on their antiretroviral therapy. So essentially they're functionally cured. But the company just did not want to invest money into looking at if that was an approach to use. So
the good news is a lot of this stuff is being looked at in combinations. I think that it's a little bittersweet, but nonetheless, it's really, we don't lose that data. We don't lose that information. And as long as we're engaged and we're able to kind of continue to point back, I think we circle back. And I think we've seen examples of that a number of times throughout this journey we've been on so far. But I do think that, interestingly, we do research to see what works and what doesn't work, and it doesn't all work. And from my perspective, that's an important thing to know too. If it works well enough, if it works in certain populations, if it works under certain circumstances, or if it can be part of a strategy that works overall, it's not time lost or money wasted. I think it's really an important, which is me agreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing. I'm just saying that, for everyone to think about that, because I know that there's a lot of sadness and frustration when you're on a study and it doesn't pan out. But I do think that it is not lost. All is not lost. And it's definitely not lost for you because you got those extra T cells, but.
Right. And I'd like to say one more thing and I'll shut up. I think one of the motivating factors for me wanting to help with this webinar and to sort of help lead it and have a discussion about getting long-term survivors and people that are aging into studies, there's a lot of reasons. But the main reason for me was that about, Jeff, 4 or 5 months ago, there was a 66-year-old man who was a long-term survivor who was cured in a cure trial. And I didn't know much about it. I hadn't been paying much attention, and I sort of stepped back for a minute. But then I heard that news. I was like, wow, this is really great news. This is motivation for people like all of us sitting around like, what are we gonna do tomorrow? I'm so bored. Help, I need help. So enjoy the trial and you just may end up being cured. I think it's time. I think that plenty of time has passed. There's still a lot of barriers, but I think we're closer than ever before. So if anything, that's motivation to join a trial.
Yeah. I definitely, you never know when your scientific contribution is going to be the scientific contribution, which is both the exciting and the scary thing about getting involved in trials, I think, right? Yeah. Quick question for Jeff. If they restart the gene therapy along those lines, will early study participants be eligible to participate in those trials? Do you think that they would allow people who've already participated in certain trials to be a part of those?
Yeah, I saw that in the chat and tried to answer.
Great.
The question is maybe. I mean, the answer rather is maybe. It all depends on what trial they design, and what they're trying to learn. But I think, I think we would all love them to go back and, take samples of Matt's blood and see, what's going on. Does he still have those modified cells, and what are they doing? How long do they last? That's the $1 million question, right? We want a one and done, give somebody a shot or an injection and have them cured. Because, all these fancy trials that we're talking about now, we can't scale worldwide, right? We
Right.
can't begin to do it here in the US. So these are all, one-off.
Jeff-
There's a lot of
Jeff,
research
remember-
happening, some really good groups looking at how we scale this up so we can have a worldwide cure. And maybe we'll do a seminar with them soon.
Jeff, remember
Matt.
when I asked that very question at your forum in Palm Springs, if I could be in another trial after all those trials I've been in, especially the Singapore trial, and the researchers that were on the panel said, I don't see any reason why not. Sure, Matt Sharp, you put your life on the line, we'll put you to trial. But I think Jeff is exactly right. It's certainly going to vary depending on what that modification did to your body and your immune system, et cetera. So
Yeah, definitely. And Don, there's another question that I'll ask you. Retention is almost as big an issue as recruitment in trials. How can we as a community help to address this?
I love these questions. I think that a big part of retention is about helping support sites and site staff and figuring out who the chatty Cathy at the site is. If the phlebotomist is the nicest person ever who remembers who's went on a new date last time they saw him, and whether or not the kids are playing Little League and that kind of stuff, then I tell sites that person should call participants between the last visit and the next visit and ask them 3 questions that have nothing to do with HIV, because that gets us back to that place where we're people talking to people. In my experience, retention has so much to do with whether or not you have a trusted relationship with someone at the site who you can call and say, listen, things are bad at home. I gotta get out of here. And then you can problem solve in advance. What happens is people disappear because they don't feel like they're connected to anybody. And then there's loss to follow up. And that's part of the problem. I'm not saying that there aren't real legitimate reasons for people to stop studies, and that is always our right. It's always our right to decide this is not the right trial for me. I have to be done. I think that people don't actually know or really believe or trust that, but that's true. That said, you want people to go into a study and also be invested in seeing the study through. But that really, from my perspective, requires relationships. Good, solid relationships where people will call and say, I need help. And also just good understanding going into a study, like, this is what the study is going to involve. These are all the ways in which we can support you. If anything comes up, I want you to call me. This is my cell phone number, or call, Lucy over there because she loves to talk to people at 3 a.m. or whatever the thing is. But I think retention is not, once again, it's not a rocket science thing. It's really about helping to kind of create a open, honest dialogue between, all the partners in the study.
Exactly. Connections. Yes, Matt, I see you.
Well, I was going to say that I think it might be one of our goals as, for this call, for the leaders of the survivor community, and for anybody who wants to come together and sort of put our heads together to find out the answers of what to do with these issues. Like, for instance, retention. Maybe there's a way, I don't know, we could find a way to get some money to help, pay people, not enough to sway them, but enough money to keep them in the trial. I don't know. Seniors need money. I mean, we're on Social Security, for God's sake. So maybe
Yeah.
provide a little bit of money, or I think it's a good opportunity for us as the community members to sit down and talk about this and come up with some ideas. I think we've all been around the block, so let's do it. Let's get together and figure some of these things out. I don't think it's that hard.
Definitely, definitely,
Well,
Jeff.
and with all due respect, we should be compensating everyone on on studies. I mean, like that's part of the deal.
Anyway.
But so I'm with you on that. And yeah, we've been around the block a few times, I'm afraid, but but that I do think that, appropriate compensation, and I mean, it's human nature, right? If you're being compensated and valued for your time, if my choice is I'm going to drive my Uber side gig for 4 hours, or I'm going to come in here and do this study, those are real choices that people make. And those are legitimate choices. And part of this stage of this movement and of this epidemic, from my perspective, is evolving the thinking around the fears and anxiety around coercion and, the inability to talk about money or compensation in any way. I think that is a little bit of an artifact of the early days of this, and we have to move beyond it.
Yeah, Jeff, I saw your hand. You wanted to add
Yeah,
something to
this
that.
is a perfect kind of segue into the importance of socio-behavioral research. We're all talking about what does it take to keep people in trials. You got to talk to the people. All these things we're talking about is what matters to the people who are going to be in these trials, what motivates them to sign up for them, what are their fears, as Don was saying, what's going to keep them in the trials, including incentives. This is something we've done some research around. And, I want to give another shout out to Corinne Dubé, who has really kind of pioneered this in the cure space and has doggedly persevered, even though they're not really handing out a lot of money yet. It's been a real uphill battle to get the researchers to realize it's not just clinical research, it's not just the biomedical part. They're people. This is human research, and we need to talk to the humans and find out what it takes for them to be in, stay in, and want to participate in trials. So that's just hugely important. And it's a real uphill battle for the advocates to make sure that the funders find a way to do this. They all pay lip service to the idea, but they're not yet really putting resources towards that, meaning money.
Yeah.
Right? But dollars talk, and that's what needs to happen. So
Yeah.
people are out
They're
there, they know how to
definitely-
do it, they want to do it, they've done a great job, and we need to fund them we can do it more to answer a lot of these questions and solve these problems.
Yeah, I feel like there's definitely a difference between incentive and compensation. And it's tomato for some people. And unless you talk to the people, you're not going to know, where they fall in that. And not just talk to people. I think allowing more people kind of with that lived experience to be on the boards from the very beginning, you avoid some of the problems with retention at the end. And so that's part of it too, is getting people involved at the start rather than at the end. There's lots of chatter in the chat. Someone says, why should I consider being in a trial? Is it because I have high T cells or low T cells, undetectable viral load or not? So what considerations do people need to take under consideration to get involved in a trial?
Can I try to answer a part of that question?
Yeah.
I was thinking about this today, this morning, driving over here, and I think a lot of what we're going to be doing now is just being altruistic. Now, I know that you've heard that before. We talked about it a lot. In the early days, we were being altruistic. We were also entering the trials because we needed to access to possibly one of the drugs in the trial. Today, we may not even be close to a cure, but we need bodies to be in the trials. So we need to be, I hope we all know what altruistic is. It's doing something for the good of mankind. And so I think we should all consider that maybe now it's time. We're all elderly now. Let's thank the Lord that we're old and that we could give something back. And that maybe is by participating in a trial. So.
Yeah, can I pile onto that for just 1 second? I prefer spicy too elderly, but whatever works for you. But choosing to be on a clinical trial is really a personal decision. It is not a it's not like you cross this mile marker and therefore this is your zone now. It's a personal decision, and there are all different motivations. I've participated in a half a dozen studies in the last 30 years, and the decision to participate in every single study I participated in was different. The thing that really drove me to look for the study or participate in the study has been different each time. So I think that some of it is about, like, are you driven to this? Is this something you're like, you know what, this would be really interesting? I know we're not allowed to say that there's any benefits for participating in clinical trials, but I think for a lot of people who struggle with adherence or just being connected, being in a trial means that you're touching base with somebody on a much more regular basis, and they know who you are and they are following things. And I think that in and of itself, for some, is really actually quite valuable. And you get access sometimes to diagnostics you might not get any other way. There's just some things about it that are that's really serve some people, and certainly have served me in the past. So I would just say the reason to participate in trials could be that you have lots of T cells, or that you have none. It could be both.
Great point. Melanie posted in the chat that structural racism needs to be dealt with, but that's a whole entire webinar all on its own, getting into that. But I just wanted to make the point that she said that, because it is a very important part of, I think, of all of that, because when you talk about structural things, it's not just the racism, there's all of the isms that we face when we want to get involved in things, and ageism is huge. So
inclusion
absolutely.
of women too.
Yeah. Right. So sexism, all of those things. We are like practically out of time, and that's what I absolutely love about doing these, is that we get so involved, it feels like a conversation, and the time goes really fast. But it's also the thing that I hate about it, because we run out of time. We have 2 minutes. Any last 30-second thoughts from each of you? Jeff?
Before Jeff starts with a sign off, I think Alistair has had his hand up for a very long time.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know if we can, I don't know if there are others. It's only strip I see on here, but just feels like we might see if we could take a quick.
Thank you for the opportunity. It was in reference to the potential for having support a social group for clinical participants, in that I have an impression, or it may be sort of a memory, of there being a reason that the study trial protocols wanted to discourage participants from talking to each other. Is that true anymore? And if it's not true, one of the best ways to enhance retention, particularly at sites that have multiple people who are in the same trial, is to have some way to encourage them to get together and talk about what's going on. And that also has the potential to bring, from the discussions that those participants have, if enough of them notice some sort of symptom in common, some sort of change in their health or whatever in common, they can then bring that to the researchers' attention.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's a completely untapped, as far as I can tell, it's a completely untapped resource.
So, and I can just say very, very quickly, I am a fan of making it an option for participants to connect with one another. There are HIPAA concerns and confidentiality concerns, and at some sites they are very gun shy, or their institution just won't allow that kind of thing. But nothing can stop people from finding each other. So sometimes there are other ways to do it. But to your point, the Gray study, which we did, 15 years ago now, gave women the option to opt in to kind of knowing others that were on the study. And that was enormously helpful for them to kind of have a common time to come in for appointments and things like that. And it was valuable more valuable than anybody at the site reaching out to them was having that kind of like sisterhood of support. So to your point, there's some real value in it. There are some actual hurdles that are not so much about, the sponsor trying to keep us apart from each other, but more about just confidentiality and HIPAA and other things like that.
That's sort of why I was suggesting the slightly formalized version of the social support group, in that those often have confidentiality agreements and requirements, and particularly if it is voluntary to join in it, that should handle the HIPAA issues. And for an example, the anchor study, where sites frequently had more than a handful of participants at each site, I suspect some useful information could have been learned from having those anchor study participants meet together every so often, the ones that were interested in it, the ones like myself that are science geeks, as you described, Dawn. The more we can encourage that, the better. As Alicia
I think
just said
part
in
of
the
that,
chat, to find out more about my body and my brain than I would know without having participated. That's a
Yes.
large part of why I got involved.
yes,
And I'll now
that's
shut up because we're short on time. Thank you.
That's okay. It's a good point that you brought up. And I think part of that goes into getting involved in the early clinical study design and suggesting those things so that it can be built into place, so that you can avoid some of that other stuff, some of the confidentiality things and things like that. But we are out of time. Please do take the survey, include it in the chat, so that we can know how we're doing. Please definitely connect with the Reunion Project. On the slide there, you can see all of the places you can, all over the web. If you have questions or additional comments for any of the participants, you can reach out directly to the Reunion Project to get connected. I really sincerely hope that you guys enjoyed this conversation. Do continue to follow along with the Reunion Project's Toolkit series, because there's all kinds of issues that address us as an aging community to be found, and some community to be found in the process. How about that? Appreciate each of you showing up. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Dawn. Thank you, Matt. I immensely enjoyed this conversation, and I hope to be in the same space with all of you again soon. Be well, everyone.
Thank
Thank you, Bridget.
Thanks, Bridget.
Thank you, everyone.